Hey everyone, Dodge here, back again for another video. This time it's a deck tech. I've been testing some new Pioneer stuff and I've been having a lot of fun with Sultai midrange. It feels a lot like Jund does in Modern. They're both value town decks. You're just trying to accrue incremental value through hand disruption, removal spells, big creatures that are undercosted. And I know we recently lost Oko, and it seemed like there wasn't anything that could really fill his shoes. The food decks have fallen off, and that's okay. And you know what? Let's go ahead and just take a moment of silence for Oko. But before we do that, I want to say real quick that Uro is insane and has totally taken Oko's place.
Just look at him. Oh, majestic. And, he gone now. He's super gone. He's gone from 3 whole constructed formats. And, like I said, in his place, we have this guy. Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, 1 green blue for a 6/6 legendary creature Elder Giant. When Uro enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it escaped. Whenever Uro enters the battlefield or attacks, you gain 3 life and draw a card, then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield, and it escapes for green, green, blue, blue, and exiling 5 other cards from your graveyard. Now, when I was initially building this deck, I thought incorrectly that maybe we only want 3 Uro because he's legendary and because escaping him costs 5 extra cards, and that's kind of a lot in a deck without dedicated ways to fill up the graveyard. And I was wrong about that.
I was wrong. I was very, very wrong. And it's gonna come up again. But yeah, I was wrong. And that's okay. I'm allowed to be wrong about things. I'm allowed to be wrong about what should be very obvious things. But let's move past that. We'll take a look at the deck, starting from the bottom up, and maybe along the way we'll make a few friends.
So the curve starts off just about like every other green deck in Pioneer does right now. 4 mana dorks, 4 Lovestruck Beast. I decided to split the dorks between Elvish Mystics and Llanowar Elves for no reason other than sometimes you get an opponent who's a bit of a gunner when it comes to their pithing needles. Now that shouldn't come up very often, but if it does, well, I mean, we're sorta prepared for it. We move on from these to a full set of Thoughtseize and Stubborn Denial and 3 Fatal Push. The meta seems friendly towards all of these cards right now. Stubborn Denial and Thoughtseize tax our opponent and make sure that whatever they're doing is a little bit more difficult to accomplish, while at the same time protecting us and our permanents and everything we're trying to do to take over the game. 3 Fatal Push seems better than 4 at the moment, as there are a lot of 3 and 4 drop creatures that are really just seeing a ton of play right now. Things like Steel Leaf Champion, Lovestruck Beast, Questing Beast, etc. And while Fatal Push is good against the mono black decks, mono black vampires, and some of the smaller creatures that we might see in the Stompy Mirrors, we really don't want to be leaning on it when we only have a couple of Fabled Passages to trigger Revolt and no real way to make that happen otherwise. Moving along to the 2-drop slot, we start off with a couple of Scavenging Ooze, which have proven to be one of the most valuable cards we could have in the deck right now. Exiling stuff from our opponent's graveyard is amazing in a metagame that is much more reliant on the graveyard as a resource than I had expected initially, plus gaining life incrementally against an aggressive and big creature metagame. And on top of all that, the thing just gets huge, and that does more than enough to make it an all-star. The rest of our 2-drops are all spells, or at least get cast as spells, with 2 each of Abrupt Decay, Brazen Borrower, and Assassin's Trophy to help us get rid of permanents that we would really rather not sit across from. I don't think I would change these numbers right now, but I could definitely see an argument for going down to 1 Borrower. And Brazen Borrower is also one of the first things up when we move on to our 3-drops. The 2 of those and the 4 Lovestruck beasts give us a bunch of threats that we're more than happy to cast, and are also fairly consistent to cast on turn 2 if we're so inclined. We also have a full playset of Uro, yes, not just 3, but a full playset of Uro. A couple of Liliana the Last Hope get rid of our opponent's smallest creatures. They also fuel our graveyard for our Uros, and if we ever ultimate one, we're probably winning the game on the spot. 2 Murderous Rider, that's just unconditional removal against other creatures and planeswalkers, and that's really what we need at the top of the curve, or close to the top of the curve. Our 4-drops are only 3 one-ofs, 3 one-ofs. Vraska Golgari Queen helps get rid of our opponent's other 3-drops, and we can sacrifice stuff to fuel our Uro and gain some life and draw a card. And like Liliana, if we ever get to ultimate this, we probably win on the spot. Everybody knows Questing Beast and how good it is. Pseudo Evasion backed up with Vigilance, Haste, and Death Touch. Plus, if it hits our opponent, it deals that much damage to one of their planeswalkers as well. There's no reason not to be playing at least one of these. Then we have Polychronos Unchained, who is a recursive threat, prevents damage that would be done to itself even if it does get smaller after it does so, fights on command. I really have been impressed with this thing, although I have to say that the escape cost is huge. But if we escape it once or twice over the course of a game, we're probably not in a position to lose. Next up, we have our mana base, which starts off simply enough with a couple of forests, 1 island, 1 swamp, and 2 Fabled Passage. This is plenty of basics to make sure that we always have something to fetch with our Fabled Passages, or in the off chance that we get Field of Ruined, we're not drawing dead off of that. Next up, we have our Shocklands. 4 Overgrown Tomb, 3 Breeding Pool, and 2 Watery Grave. This feels like more than enough to make sure that we can cast all of our spells on time, and it also does a great job at making sure that our 2 Hinterland Harbor and 2 Drowned Catacomb come in untapped. We also have a couple of Llanowar Wastes that come in untapped, just in case our mana draws aren't great. It's something to help us get those turn 1 Thoughtseizes and Mana Dorks out, while later on we can just tap it for colorless mana when we don't need to lose the life. And the last card of the deck is also another newcomer from Theros Beyond Death, Labyrinth of Skophos. And this has done a great job at protecting us so far from things like the aggressive mono black decks later in the game when they're mainly just getting in with stuff that we can block and a single Knight of the Ebon Legion that we can't afford to. I haven't had to use it against blocking creatures yet, but that's always something that could come up, and if it does, I think this card will do a fine job at dealing with it. Hopefully, this works out for the foreseeable future. I would much rather have this at the moment than another utility land like a Field of Ruin, but I could see an argument for wanting something like a Hissing Quagmire in its place.
So now that we've gotten through the main deck, let's just take a couple of minutes and go over the sideboard and the changes that I've made over the past few days of actually testing this deck.
The sideboard starts off easily enough with 2 Ceremonious Rejection and 2 Mystical Dispute. I shouldn't have to get into too much of how good these cards are and against what matchups, But after some more testing, I decided that maybe dropping a ceremonious rejection for an extra reclamation stage would be a good idea, and I've liked this so far, even though this did change again recently. Currently, one ceremonious rejection, one reclamation stage, and two mystical disputes are what I have in the sideboard in these slots. Next up, I started with two Despise, which seem particularly good in this metagame. All of the big creature decks and all of the decks that operate with planeswalkers, things like Chonky Red, Despise just seems better than Duress at the moment. Although Duress is very, very important and still very, very good, it just doesn't come up as often as Despise does. And I think that's okay. Although, again, this is another thing that changed a little bit later on, and now we're up to 2 Duress currently, because apparently Starfield of Nyx is just the new hotness. Speaking of decks like Starfield, we have 2 Ashiok Dreamrender and a single Unmoored Ego to help us deal with those and other combo decks, as well as fighting graveyard strategies like Arclight Phoenix. It's surprising how relevant the graveyard is right now, and I know I keep saying that, and I'm also playing a deck that cares about its graveyard, but these have been pretty much sided in, I'd say, in 2/3 of the matches I've played, and I've never been upset about having any of them come in from the sideboard for games 2 and 3. We move along from these to a couple of heroic intervention, which is where I started off as a way to fight the blue-white control decks and things like Niv to Mind, where Deafening Clarions and Supreme Verdicts run rampant. Later, this was changed, and the other Duress came in the place of one of the heroic interventions. This was mostly done because I was seeing less and less control and Niv to Light strategies, and more decks like Starfield to Nyx. Starfield of Nyx? Nyx to Light? Look, whatever it is, it's all over the place, and it's a lot harder to beat than I had initially expected. And when I first built the deck, I thought that one Mistcutter Hydra and one Reclamation Sage would be enough. And one Mistcutter Hydra has definitely been enough to help me get over some blue-white control matchups and even helped against mono-blue tempo and spirits, but one Reclamation Sage wasn't cutting it, so I went up to 2. And then I remembered that Back to Nature is a card. So I still have one Reclamation Sage in the deck because the artifact decks are definitely a problem when they come up. They're probably the worst matchup besides the big green ramp decks that rely on Eldrazi and cast triggers and Ugins to win the game. But Back to Nature is just too good to pass up, especially again with a whole bunch of black-white Starfield decks running around. The last card is also the last new card from Theros Beyond Death that I'm playing, but it's the one that I've been the most excited to toy around with, and it's actually pretty relevant most of the time I actually get to cast it. Cure Best the Sea God is a 7-mana saga, 3 chapters, the first creating an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token with hexproof, the second putting to sleep all of our opponent's non-land permanents, and that right there is usually enough to win the game. But if it isn't, and we do need to complete the saga, we just gain control of target permanent and opponent controls and untap it. Permanently. That's ours now. Really, we should have won the game the turn before, but in case we didn't, we will now. I don't think I've cast this more than once or twice and lost, but I've definitely cast it more than once or twice. It's probably the most relevant card we have in the sideboard against other big stompy decks, and it just does everything that you want it to. Well, I mean, assuming everything you want it to do is win.
And that's what I'm working with right now. I've been doing a lot of testing on Magic Online, just tweaking the deck and getting a feel for it. and I think it's in a pretty good place, or at the very least has a lot of potential going forward. I'll be playing a league with it and streaming later on. If you want to check out the links below, subscribe, like whatever channels, follow on social media, get notified when I'm doing things here or on Twitch or Twitter or any of the places where you decide to go and click buttons. It's free to click buttons, just in case you didn't know that. Let me know in the comments what you want to see me play later on. There's a Golgari and Norzov brew I'm looking forward to trying in Pioneer. And as always, have a great day.